For years, he avoided the cuff, the numbers, the quiet fear of what they might reveal. Skipping pressure checks felt easier than facing change. What finally made him stop wasn't a scare or a diagnosis, but a realization about time, control, and self-respect. For many years, skipping pressure checks did not feel like a decision. It felt like relief. There was no dramatic moment where he chose to ignore them, no defiance, no belief that they didn't matter. It started quietly, almost innocently, as habits often do. A missed appointment here, a forgotten reading there. Life was busy, responsibilities piled up, and each skipped check felt small enough to dismiss. At first, the avoidance had a practical explanation. The cuff was uncomfortable. The numbers were unsettling. Sitting still and waiting for the result always brought a flicker of unease. He told himself he would check later, when things felt calmer, when life slowed down, when he felt more prepared to deal with whatever the numbers might say. That later moment kept moving further away. Over time, skipping became routine. Weeks passed, then months, eventually years. And with each skipped check, the urgency faded a little more. If something were truly wrong, he reasoned, surely he would feel it. The absence of symptoms became reassurance. Silence felt like permission. Avoidance often disguises itself as peace. When you don't look at something, it stops demanding your attention. There is no uncomfortable reading, no decision to make, no reminder of vulnerability. For a while, that quiet feels like calm, but it is not the same thing. It is simply the absence of information. As the years went on, the habit solidified. Pressure checks became something he vaguely knew he should do, the way people know they should clean out the garage or organize old papers. Important, but not urgent. Easy to postpone without immediate consequence. There was also pride mixed into the avoidance. He had lived a full life. He had worked hard, supported others, carried responsibilities without complaint. Part of him believed that paying close attention to numbers felt like admitting weakness. He didn't want to be someone who hovered over measurements or worried excessively. He wanted to feel capable, normal, unburdened by constant monitoring. So he trusted his instincts instead. He judged his well-being by how he moved through the day. If he could get up in the morning, handle his tasks, and sleep at night, that felt like enough evidence that things were fine. Pressure checks became something associated with illness, and he did not see himself as ill. Denial doesn't always feel like denial. Often, it feels like optimism, like choosing not to borrow trouble, like believing tomorrow will look much like today, and for a long time that belief held. But avoidance has a cost that rarely announces itself immediately. It doesn't arrive as a single mistake. It accumulates quietly. Each skipped check removes a small opportunity to notice change. Each year without information widens the gap between perception and reality. Looking back, he could see how avoidance narrowed his awareness. He wasn't making informed choices, he was making comfortable ones. He wasn't refusing care, he was postponing it indefinitely. And because nothing dramatic happened, the habit reinforced itself. What made this pattern particularly powerful was how reasonable it felt. There was always a justification. He was busy, he felt fine. He would do it later. And later never came. Avoidance thrives in normalcy. When life appears stable, the motivation to look closer fades. But the body does not stop changing just because it isn't being observed. Pressure doesn't wait for permission. It shifts quietly, influenced by age, stress, and time. At the time, none of this felt urgent. The habit of avoidance blended seamlessly into daily life. It became invisible, and that invisibility made it dangerous, not because something bad was guaranteed to happen, but because awareness slowly slipped away. It would take years before he understood that skipping checks wasn't protecting his peace. It was postponing responsibility, and responsibility, once delayed long enough, becomes heavier when it finally returns. That realization, however, did not come all at once. It began with a simple but unsettling truth. Feeling fine is not the same thing as being well. For a long time, he believed his body would tell him when something was wrong. That belief felt reasonable. Pain, fatigue, dizziness. These were signals he understood. He trusted his senses. If nothing felt off, he assumed nothing was. But pressure doesn't always speak loudly. Often, it doesn't speak at all. Years passed where he felt largely unchanged. He woke up, moved through his routines, handled stress as he always had. There were days when he felt tired, days when he felt tense, but nothing that stood out as alarming. Life carried its usual weight, and he carried it as he always had. This reinforced his belief that skipping checks was harmless. After all, how could something be wrong if he felt normal? The absence of discomfort became evidence in his mind. What he didn't understand yet was that the body can adapt to slow changes in ways that mask their significance. Gradual shifts become background noise. What would feel alarming if it happens suddenly feels manageable when it unfolds over years. Pressure changes are often subtle. They don't demand attention the way acute pain does. They don't interrupt daily tasks. They simply exist in the background, influencing the body quietly, steadily. Feeling fine can be misleading because it reflects only the present moment. It does not reveal trends. It does not show direction. It does not tell you where things have been or where they may be heading. Without regular checks, he had no context, no baseline, no sense of whether things were stable, improving, or drifting upward. Each day stood alone, disconnected from the last. He began to realize this later, when small things started to change, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to prompt reflection. Recovery took longer. Stress lingered. Sleep felt lighter. These shifts were easy to attribute to age, to circumstance, to the natural wear of time. And perhaps some of them were. But without information, everything blurred together. Age became a catch-all explanation. Pressure remained unexamined. There is comfort in believing that awareness equals worry. That if you don't look, you won't stress. But awareness does not automatically create anxiety. Often, it reduces it. Uncertainty is what fuels unease. Looking back, he could see how relying solely on how he felt kept him reactive rather than proactive. He responded to discomfort when it appeared, but he missed the opportunity to notice patterns before they became problems. Feeling fine allowed him to delay decisions. Being informed would have required engagement. Engagement felt heavier than avoidance, at least at first. The difference between feeling fine and being well is subtle but important. Feeling fine is subjective. It changes with mood, sleep, and circumstance. Being well requires observation over time. It requires context. Pressure does not ask how you feel before it changes. It responds to stress, habits, and age regardless of perception. And without regular checks, those changes remain invisible. This understanding did not arrive with fear. It arrived with clarity, a slow realization that comfort had been mistaken for safety, that silence had been mistaken for stability. As this awareness began to form, something shifted internally. He started questioning assumptions he had carried for years, and those questions set the stage for a moment that would change how he viewed pressure checks forever, not through fear, but through understanding. The change did not come with urgency or fear. There was no alarming symptom, no dramatic phone call, no moment where everything suddenly felt at risk. In many ways, that is what made it so powerful. The shift came quietly, through a moment that felt ordinary at the time. but later revealed itself as pivotal. It happened during a conversation that wasn't meant to be profound. He was sitting with someone he trusted, someone who had lived long enough to speak with perspective rather than urgency. The subject of health came up naturally, as it often does among people who have seen time pass. There was no lecturing, no warning, just a simple remark about how knowing something is different from fearing it. The words stayed with him longer than he expected. Later that day, he found himself thinking about pressure checks in a new way. For years, he had associated them with judgment. High numbers felt like failure. Low numbers felt like temporary relief. Either way, the act of checking felt like opening a door to something he didn't want to deal with. But what if the numbers weren't a verdict? What if they were simply information? This idea unsettled him at first. Information carries responsibility, but it also carries clarity. He realized that his avoidance hadn't been about fear of illness. It had been about fear of being labeled by himself most of all. That night he reflected on how often he had equated knowing with worrying, as if awareness automatically led to anxiety. But as he examined his life more honestly, he saw the opposite pattern. The things he understood best were the things he worried about least. Familiarity had always brought calm. Pressure checks, by contrast, had remained unfamiliar because he had kept them at a distance. A few days later, he decided to check not because he felt unwell, but because he felt curious. That distinction mattered. Curiosity carries less tension than fear. It opens rather than braces. The first check didn't feel triumphant or devastating. It simply felt informative. The number was not what he expected, but it also wasn't catastrophic. What surprised him most was how little emotional weight it carried once it existed. The fear he had imagined for years did not materialize. Instead, there was relief. Not because the number was perfect, but because uncertainty had been replaced with something concrete. That moment changed how he viewed pressure checks entirely. They were no longer tests to pass or fail. They were snapshots, pieces of a larger picture that only made sense over time. He began to see that avoiding information had kept him stuck in a loop of assumptions. Checking allowed him to step out of that loop. The number itself mattered less than the act of knowing. What followed was not an immediate transformation. He did not suddenly become vigilant or obsessive, but the mental barrier had cracked. Pressure checks no longer represented judgment. They represented awareness. That shift from fear to neutrality was the real turning point. As he began checking more regularly, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling more anxious, he felt calmer. The act of awareness, which he had avoided for so long, brought a sense of steadiness he hadn't realized was missing. Regular checks created context. One number no longer stood alone. Patterns emerged. Fluctuations made sense. A higher reading on a stressful day no longer felt ominous. It felt explainable. Lower readings felt reassuring but not intoxicating. Awareness replaced imagination. With each check, his relationship with pressure became more balanced. He stopped seeing it as something that could suddenly betray him. Instead, it became something he could observe, understand, and respond to thoughtfully. There was also a shift in how he felt emotionally. Avoidance had kept him in a vague state of tension, even when he didn't recognize it as such. Awareness, paradoxically, relaxed him. Knowing where he stood allowed his body to settle. He noticed this most clearly in how he thought about the future. Before, uncertainty hovered over his plans. It was subtle, but present. Now he felt grounded. Not because everything was perfect, but because he was no longer guessing. Regular checks did not make him fixated, they made him informed. And information restored a sense of partnership with his own body. He was no longer reacting blindly. He was participating. This participation brought dignity. He wasn't being monitored by fear or obligation. He was choosing to stay present in his own life. Each check became an act of respect rather than surveillance. He also realized that awareness didn't demand immediate action every time. Sometimes the number simply existed. Other times it prompted reflection. But it never demanded panic. Over time, the habit of checking became as neutral as checking the weather. Useful, informative, and rarely emotional. What surprised him most was how much lighter he felt once avoidance was gone. Carrying uncertainty had been heavier than he realized. Awareness removed that burden. Still, as helpful as this change was, it also brought a wave of reflection. With clarity came hindsight, and with hindsight came questions about the years spent avoiding. Those questions were not harsh, but they were honest, and they led him to consider what long-term avoidance had quietly cost, not in catastrophe, but in missed understanding. That reflection would shape the next phase of his journey. Looking back, he could see that 20 years had passed, not in a single blur, but in a series of quiet compromises. None of them dramatic, none of them catastrophic, just small choices to wait a little longer, to assume things were fine, to keep moving without looking too closely. He had not lost those years to illness or crisis. He had lived them fully. But beneath that fullness, there was an invisible cost, one that had less to do with his physical numbers and more to do with awareness itself. The first cost was missed patterns. There were likely changes along the way, subtle, gradual, almost imperceptible shifts that he never saw coming because he wasn't looking. Had he checked, he might have noticed the gentle upward trends that happen long before they become problems. The small corrections that could have made larger ones unnecessary. The second cost was trust, not in others, but in himself. For 2 decades, he had quietly avoided something he knew mattered. That avoidance had become a quiet form of self-doubt. It didn't surface often, but it lived there, a sense that he was putting off something he shouldn't. Even when he didn't consciously think about it, that unacknowledged avoidance carried a weight. He began to realize that ignoring what mattered didn't actually protect his peace. It only delayed it. Each time he told himself later, a small part of him knew that later might never come. That quiet dissonance built over time. There was also a cost to perspective. Without data, he had no narrative. No way to understand how stress, diet, rest, or time were shaping him. Each year existed in isolation, with no thread connecting them. The story of his health remained half-written, missing the middle pages that would have explained the later ones, but the deepest cost was emotional. For 20 years, he had lived in a delicate balance between comfort and uncertainty. He thought he was choosing calm. In truth, he was choosing distance, and distance, while protective, can slowly disconnect us from our own lives. He realized that avoidance doesn't just keep us from information, it keeps us from participation. When he finally began checking regularly, that lost connection started to return. There was something almost intimate about the act, a small moment of honesty with himself. The numbers didn't define him, they simply reflected him. They were proof that he was still here, still learning, still capable of choosing awareness over fear. He didn't waste energy on regret. Regret would have been easy, even tempting, but it would have led him back toward guilt, which he had spent enough years carrying. Instead, he chose compassion. The person who skipped those checks wasn't careless or foolish. He was simply tired, overwhelmed, human. He could see now that avoidance had been an attempt at self-preservation, a way to feel in control when control felt uncertain. There was tenderness in that realization. He forgave himself for it, and through that forgiveness, he found peace not in perfect health, but in honesty. He could finally see that the real harm of those skipped checks was not in what he missed physically, but in what he withheld emotionally. a chance to face himself fully, without fear or denial. That clarity brought a gentleness to how he approached life now. No rushing, no punishment, no extremes, just quiet consistency and respect for the lessons time had taught him, even if they arrived slowly. The years had taken their share, as years do, but they had also given him something far more lasting: perspective. And perspective, once earned, changes everything, including how you define what truly matters. In the end, the story wasn't about what he had skipped, it was about what he had finally reclaimed: awareness, dignity, and the right to stay present in his own story. And it was that awareness that carried him into the final truth. The real reason he had finally stopped skipping those checks after all those years. When people asked what made him start checking again after 20 years, he could never quite reduce it to one reason. Fear wasn't it. Worry wasn't either. It was something quieter, deeper, something that had grown slowly as he aged. He began to think differently about time. When you're young, time feels endless, stretching ahead like a long, open road. But as the years gather, you start to feel its shape more clearly. You begin to understand that how you live each moment defines how the remaining ones will unfold. One evening, he sat alone in his kitchen. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes when you've lived long enough to notice how precious silence really is. On the counter sat his old pressure cuff, the same one he'd once avoided. He hadn't used it in years, but something about that night felt different. He thought about his father, and how aging had softened him in ways strength never could. He thought about friends who had learned too late what could have been seen earlier. He thought about his own body, not as an obstacle, but as a lifelong companion. And for the first time, he felt something he hadn't in a long while: respect. Respect for the years that had carried him. Respect for the body that had stayed loyal through work, stress, loss, and joy. Respect for the fact that staying alive wasn't just about endurance. It was about attention. He didn't want to spend his later years pretending he didn't need care. He wanted to offer himself the same patience he had offered everyone else. That night, he took the cuff, wrapped it around his arm, and pressed the button. The soft whirring sound filled the room, gentle, almost meditative. When the number appeared, he didn't feel dread. He felt calm. Because now, it wasn't about the result. It was about the act itself. He had stopped skipping his checks because he finally understood what they meant. They weren't symbols of aging or decline. They were symbols of presence, proof that he was still paying attention, still here, still part of his own story. The real reason he changed wasn't fear of what could go wrong. It was love for what was still right. Over the next months, he began checking regularly again, not obsessively, but consistently. Each time he felt a quiet reassurance, not because the numbers were perfect, but because they were real. Reality, he found, was kinder than avoidance. He also noticed that the habit began to affect other parts of his life. He became more patient with his body, more forgiving of its limits, more curious about its needs. Awareness in one area gently invited awareness in others. He started walking more slowly, not as a sign of age, but as a sign of care. He ate not to restrict, but to nourish. He rested not from exhaustion, but from respect. There was no dramatic transformation, just a steady return to honesty, the kind that brings both peace and clarity. In his later years, he would sometimes reflect on that long period of avoidance. He didn't view it as failure anymore. It was simply part of his journey, a chapter he had to live through to understand the cost of silence and the power of awareness. And when he thought about the younger version of himself, the man who avoided the cuff, who convinced himself that feeling fine was enough, he didn't feel disappointment. He felt compassion, because that man was trying to protect himself the only way he knew how. But now he understood something the younger man couldn't. The peace doesn't come from not knowing. It comes from knowing and still being at ease. He stopped skipping because he wanted to meet his future self with honesty, not surprise. Because he wanted the years ahead to feel steady, not uncertain. Because, in the end, caring for himself wasn't a task. It was a promise, a quiet promise to stay aware, stay kind, and stay present. One simple check at a time, and perhaps that is the truest form of wisdom that aging offers. The understanding that peace is not found in avoidance but in awareness, that looking closely at life, even at the parts we once feared, does not make it smaller. It makes it more whole.